Hey everybody, this is Manny Faces, producer and host of Newsbeat, back with you again for another episode of BackBeat, our behind-the-scenes look at our full episodes. We do the backbeats to make sure that we give a little bit of additional insight into the making of the information that prompted the creation of our full episodes. If you haven't already checked our latest episode, it is titled MS-13, Made in the USA. That's what we're here to discuss. We certainly want you to listen to the full episode before you listen to us here. So go back and do that if you haven't already. We'll wait. All right, great. Also of note, you can visit our website for all of our past episodes and backbeats and full stories that accompany each episode. I think that's something that people are impressed with. They tell us they love the full stories, that if we give a full episode about a topic that they'd like to know more about, they can go to the website usnewsbeat.com and read an entire what we call cover story that goes with each episode. So it's great to get everything packed into these 20-minute episodes. They're great for the commute. And of course, you can subscribe to the podcast wherever you find podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, TuneIn, Stitcher, we're everywhere. So you can do that as well. But if you want a little bit more insight, it's a great place to go. There you can also contact us if you have any questions or have any show topic ideas. We're actually always on the lookout for interesting ways to look at topics of social justice, civil liberties, and all the kind of good stuff that we cover on Newsbeat. And last but not least, if you do feel so inclined and you like our work, you can swing over to our support page. It's usnewsbeat.com/support. We make sure that these donations go toward the fund that pays our artists. You know that we bring in independent artists to create original lyrical content that matches and amplifies the topics covered in each episode. It's a monumental task. We have the best MCs. We have the best artists. Believe me, they're the best. Trust me, everyone says it. And we bring them in, we pay them, we compensate them for their artistic work. It is very high quality. It adds great commentary and makes these episodes ever so compelling. We'd like to continue to do that. We want to make sure that they get compensated. Your help can help us help them. So please, usnewsbeat.com/support, and give you more insight about where that money goes, and our Artist in Residence program is all there. So without further ado, I'm joined, as I always am, by my fearless colleagues at Newsbeat, the editor-in-chief, Chris Tawarski.
What's up, Manny?
And the managing editor, Rashed Mian.
Yo.
Hovering over us in spirit form is our executive producer, Jed Maury. Here we are discussing the latest episode, MS-13, Made in the USA, a truly important and timely and extremely interesting, I thought, did I say informative?
Kick-ass?
A pretty kick-ass episode. We talked about the idea of MS-13, the ruthless gang that has taken over certain neighborhoods around the country. Definitely do some bad things, and we get into sort of their tactics a little bit, but the angle we took with this episode is sort of the historical background. We hear a lot about this. We hear a lot about it from our political figures, especially President Trump, who delivers very fearful messages about MS-13's influence on their neighborhoods and society at large. Some of it is a little bit hyperbolic. Some of it is worthy of discussion for sure. But what isn't told is the fact that MS-13 isn't what many people think of, in that the United States actually helped create this gang, create the problem that they now sort of rail against and propose solutions for, that, if you look back historically, are kind of the reasons why they're here in the first place. So it's an interesting episode. You're joining us now. You've heard it. You're like, wow, this is amazing. Our amazing musical guests on this, Rebel Diaz and Cruise Control from Reyes del Bajo Mundo, El Salvadoran group, added their unique perspectives to this. It was a powerful episode. We're here to kick it and talk about it a little bit more. Chris, please, aside from the musical guests, as you do always, introduce the voices that we had, and let's get into it.
Right. So we spoke with Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist and author Raymond Bonner, who is one of two journalists who went to the site of a village in El Salvador a month after what has been dubbed the worst massacre possibly in Latin American history, known as the El Mozote massacre, where up to 1,000 civilians, villagers, were slaughtered, many of them women and children. And he exposed that for the New York Times in January 1982. We spoke with Jose Miguel Cruz, the current director of research at Florida International University's Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center. And we also spoke with Patrick Young, an immigration attorney, immigration rights advocate, the program director at CARISON, which stands for the Central American Refugee Center. And he's also the co-founder of the Long Island Civic Engagement Table. And I think to kick this BackBeat off, I think it's important just for listeners to get a little bit of context. That being that, Manny, as you just said, I think that the perception out there, and especially off of the president's rhetoric, is that MS-13 is an import to the United States, when in fact it is an export. It was created here,
Right.
On American soil, in the midst of the El Salvadoran Civil War. And just a little bit on that, I mean, that raged from 1979 through 1992 and claimed more than 75,000 lives, displaced up to 1 million or more people. And, the word brutal, I mean, doesn't even come close to the atrocities that were committed during this conflict. We're talking death squads.
Right.
We're talking mass executions. We're talking mutilations. We're talking mass rapes, primarily by a regime that was supported financially by the United States, by the administrations of President Carter and President Reagan. So when you hear these things on the news and you hear the president yelling and screaming about MS-13 and we need the southern wall, to stop, these bad hombres from coming in and murdering and raping, you need to understand that it was the United States, unfortunately, that part and parcel gave birth to MS-13. For listeners who may not know, we're speaking to you from Long Island, which has one of the largest concentrations of MS-13 in the United States. I think second only to Los Angeles area. Mm-hmm. Long Island has sort of become the poster child of this fight against MS-13, legitimately due to the amount of slayings committed by the gang here. In an 18-month period, 17 people, mostly teenagers, were killed primarily in extremely gruesome, means by machete, mutilations, tortured,
Right.
beforehand.
Right.
And this prompted President Trump to, number one, come here last July and hold a very publicized press conference where he called some of the suburban neighborhoods here, quote, killing fields, before he repitched, his proposal for the southern wall, tens of thousands more immigration agents to be hired.
Right.
And he had as his guests of honor at his first State of the Union this past January, the parents of two teenage girls, Kayla Cuevas and Nisa Mickens, who were slain by MS-13 out here on Long Island. And again, that was the preface into his reiteration and call for the southern border wall and, stricter immigration policies. And I just want to quote him from that night. This is the President Trump, quote, "Tonight, I am calling on the Congress to finally close the deadly loopholes that have allowed MS-13 and other criminals to break into our country." Rashed, maybe you could shed a little bit of light on some of the problems with that statement.
Well, I guess firstly that what if you're hearing it on the call, you're like, okay, we want to stop people from coming here and killing everybody, but what he's doing is that the rhetoric actually over exaggerates the threat that experts say MS-13 actually poses. The slayings obviously are horrific, especially when they're young people living in our communities. But the appeal a lot of times by politicians, and it happened in the last election in November, is to send around leaflets and flyers showing tattooed up Spanish people claiming that they're going to come here and murder your children. But that typically doesn't happen. It's important to understand the context. A lot of people fled El Salvador because of the brutal, oppressive regime there, a regime that had the goal to actually kill the Archbishop Oscar Romero
Right.
at the pew one day after, he was sort of speaking to the soldiers of that regime, saying stop the repression, and then he was slaughtered the next day.
And he actually wrote to President Carter asking to suspend aid to that regime.
And that was March 24th, 1980, so we're 38-year anniversary of his death. The other sad thing that doesn't get mentioned a lot about the Oscar Romero situation is that, again, when thousands gathered for his funeral in El Salvador, it was actually bombed. So there was up to 36 people who were actually killed at his funeral.
Oh, wow.
People who were mostly peasants who were trying to flee El Salvador for neighboring Honduras were gunned down by air. These are innocent people literally just trying to run for their lives. And they were gunned down. So that's why I'm bringing this up. And that's why I think it's important what Chris said about just the tragedies that unfolded over that about decade or 12 years of this war.
Right.
Mothers said they sent their sons here to America because they didn't want them to either join the leftist guerrillas or to have to join the military. So they said, we're going to send you to America. And within, I think, 3 years, 500,000 refugees ended up in the United States.
Right.
And then they gathered in Los Angeles. And, they wanted to find camaraderie, and they were living in the streets basically because they're penniless. So that's why it's important to, to think about this in that context because, as Chris mentioned, this is an export that we created. We deported a lot of these people back to El Salvador, which was already a failing state at that point, into prisons where they were with other violent people. And that's sort of where the nucleus of the gang originated.
Right. It seems almost like then it becomes a cycle.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy or something.
Right. They come here with nothing because of our practices tore their country up and drove them out. They came here, land of opportunity. It's America. And if they came illegally or not, it's very often people who escape these kind of situations do migrate illegally, so to speak. Some of them eventually become naturalized or citizens, but in many cases, again, coming here with nothing, not having the support structure, they get rounded up, sent back. As Bonner, explained, they go back with no skills. All they know is this kind of violence that's going on. There's violence down there. They're thrown in jail down there. They're, and so they sort of strategize and come together as a gang for, self-protection. And, I thought it was interesting. I think it was Cruz who said in the episode that it's not a money-making gang. It's not like, some of these criminal enterprises. This is sort of a sad tale of survival in horrible conditions. Now, the disclaimer I need to make, of course, is that we're not defending MS-13. Right. We're not defending members of this gang. We're not defending people who carry out these brutal, slayings and terrorize neighborhoods. That absolutely happens, and we need to do whatever we can do, and we encourage law enforcement to protect the citizens. It was mentioned in the episode that a lot of times the idea is thrown out there that we're all at risk. We're all, this is they're gonna get us. They're gonna get us all. They're gonna get
the majority of Americans probably never even came upon somebody who
they kill and they terrorize sort of their own little enclaves in their own little neighborhoods. And instead of trying to protect the citizens of those enclaves and really try to solve the problem, I think is what it is here, is we mass deport, grab up everybody we can, throw them back, cycle continues, and then we use that as fear-mongering tactics to, again, as Chris said, drum up support for these very harsh immigration policies that wouldn't then end the problem.
Or building a wall. That's what we're saying.
Right.
It's important to have this discussion with your disclaimer because just building a wall is not going to stop the problem. Jailing drug dealers is not going to stop the problem. People have an addiction problem.
Sure.
So when you're talking about MS-13 is what Raymond Bonner actually brought up, I think, toward the end of the episode, where he said we should start pouring money into the country to actually help them. Because at the height of the Civil War, El Salvador, the repressive regime, was getting financial aid and military aid from the U.S. government, and it was the third most foreign aid that we were giving to any other government behind Israel and Egypt.
Right.
So just to have an understanding of just how much, especially the Reagan administration, thought it was important to step into this war because they had this fear of communism during the Cold War. Right. So, but we didn't do anything to actually improve the situation that we helped create.
Wait a minute. Are you saying that the United States goes into other countries of the world to further
Iraq,
their own,
Afghanistan,
their own,
Syria,
those kind of places,
Libya,
and then
Yemen.
doesn't help pick up the pieces afterwards? Doesn't financially build it back up?
It is one of those mind-boggling things, and I wish we had like a politician on here that we could talk to and say, look, so you're fine with spending billions that would help go toward killing
Right.
basically people. But why isn't there a proportionate amount of money being spent to actually raise up people's lives? So then there's no reason for them to flee their country. I think when you listen to these people during interviews, a lot of people don't want to flee their country.
Right.
They're doing it because they basically have to do it for survival.
So, and I think that's why this episode is important. If you don't recognize your history, you're doomed to repeat it, right? So if we know that this is where these gangs have come from, expertly laid out in the episode by our very informative guest voices, then we'll possibly make the same mistakes going forward when dealing with other countries and how we engage.
But it seems like we're still doing that. I mean, we
So that's important.
have a long history of intervention in Latin America, and now we're doing the same thing in the Middle East, right, Chris?
Right. And then what happens is now we have this problem. Throwing these kind of blanket solutions and fear-mongering tactics does not solve the problem at the same time.
Right. And to even begin to understand or discuss some of these topics, the border wall, more immigration, agents, you need to be informed with the entire picture, and that's what we're doing here. The majority of the public, I would assume, have no idea. For example, the El Mozote massacre was carried out at the hands of a battalion known as the Atlacatl Battalion. They were trained by the United States. Just as a simple taxpayer, wouldn't you want to know that your hard-earned money went to killing women and children in another country? I think you have a right to know that. And that's not something that you're going to hear on TV. That's just something you're even going to read in history books.
Right.
Just to a little background, too, on Oscar Romero. It's hard, I think, to fully understand just how big a deal that was. That wasn't just... Oscar Romero was the most revered religious figure in the entire country.
Maybe the figure in general, right?
Yep. And he was gunned down while giving mass.
And speaking to his importance, Pope Francis has declared that he's going to be Romero will be canonized, which I think is going to happen this year or early next year too.
Wow.
So,
I think this speaks to all of the greater picture here. When you look at the gang problem in America, whether it be MS-13 or Bloods and Crips or Latin Kings or all the other and the 18th Street, which is the other El Salvadorian gang. When you look at how the gang problem has emerged and been part of the kind of culture of America, these things have beginnings. Mm-hmm. They have origins. They have a genesis.
Right. They don't just come out of
nowhere. They
nowhere.
don't just come out of nowhere. These aren't just people being bad for the sake of it. These aren't, you know what I mean? Like there's reasons why all of these things happen. And what it does is it should help you just kind of open up your mind and perspective a little bit to understand why communities have devolved in this manner, why crime is rampant, why gangs are there. It largely has to do with survival under conditions that are put in place by systems out of your control. And when you grow up as a kid in the 80s in El Salvador, this is what you're faced with because of external federal policies carried out by the world's greatest superpower.
Right.
And when you look at African American communities in America, the oppression, the oppressive regimes that we've covered in Why We Riot, and in other episodes that we've covered, you start to realize that it's the same superpower. It's the same, just done domestically. We do the same things. We make moves that are oppressive, and then the people who are left to suffer under those policies need to find a way to survive. And sometimes that works out in criminalistic ways. So again, if you're going to just kind of, it's a great quote. Who said it? Mark Fallon in our Guantanamo Bay episode says, you don't fight fire with fire. That's the work of an arsonist.
Right.
You fight fire by depriving it of oxygen, which means you really go after the source of the problem. So at what point is this country going to start realizing that by our actions, we're the source of these problems?
Well, we have a hard time reconciling with what we've done in the past.
Sure, but we can't keep making these mistakes. This is the lesson to be learned in MS-13. If you want to look at MS-13 and how it's terrorizing neighborhoods within this country, first of all, protect the citizens of those neighborhoods that are citizens and children that are, maybe their parents were illegal, but they're citizens. These are United States children that are being terrorized. So protect them, go after the source. But if the source of that problem is lack of economic development in their home country, lack of foreign policy that looks after other countries in the world instead of just trying to rip them of their resources, take over their regimes, and be the kind of colonizing force that the United States has been all these years, that's the source of the problem.
Right. And Patrick Young talks about the idea of some of the young kids that are fleeing Central America now, either Honduras or El Salvador. These are unaccompanied minors who are fleeing because they want to get away from forced gang recruitment.
Right.
A lot of these people are forced into the gangs, especially when they're living in these small villages or in rural areas. They come here trying to get safety. And now because of this heightened immigration awareness and what the Trump administration is trying to do, where they're deporting people in mass, as we just saw earlier this week in Tennessee, where they grabbed 97 people at a meatpacking plant, brought them to detention centers or to offices to find out if they should be deported. But it's all part of the policy, right? And there was a recent study that just came out that I hope everybody reads. It was a joint effort by the New York Times and the Marshall Project, which is a nonprofit.
Yeah.
They titled it "The Myth of the Criminal Immigrant," and they looked into this study, which was conducted by 4 major universities in the United States, and it says a large majority of the areas have many more immigrants today, the areas that they studied, including cities, than they did in 1980, and fewer violent crimes. So the study also went on to look at 136 metro areas in the United States, and almost 70% of those studied, the immigrant population increased from 80 to 2016, while crime either stayed stable or actually decreased.
Wow.
So this is just all part of the rhetoric that the immigrants are coming in here and they're causing high levels of crime, when the studies actually are disputing that.
That's a great point, and a great segue into this quote that I wanted to read from Patrick Young in the episode that speaks to when you don't tell the full story and you don't have that context, how the hell are you ever actually going to solve the problem? You're not, because you're misidentifying.
Right.
And his quote was, "This is being depicted as a war against MS-13, but the people who are mostly being targeted are the victims of MS-13. And I think that's something that a lot of the Americans don't understand. MS-13 attacks almost exclusively people who are within the Latino community or children of Latino immigrants. And we're not seeing the Trump administration reach out to the victims. It's as though you had a war on domestic violence that went primarily after the women who are suffering beatings."
Yep.
Right. And if you deport some of these unaccompanied minors who fled forced recruitment, you know, what Young told us, they'll either be in the gangs or it's a death sentence. You know, you fled us.
You left. That's true. Yeah.
And this is what's going to happen.
We're going to.
Well, because they want to make a point, obviously, to other people that
don't
are
leave
in those communities.
Well, I think that's profound. I think that statement says it all. And what you just said, Chris, really says it all. You know, if you don't know the whole story, how can we get comprehensive immigration reform past partisan politics or whatever the case may be? If these things are not being
part of the equation,
and if they're not
a critical part of the equation,
right? Of course. So we did our part. We do what we can over here at Newsbeat to try to add to the equation in a positive manner.
Right.
But it's knowing the context, knowing the big picture, not lashing out with emotional or fear-based, politicized.
Right.
There's so many ways to handle this problem that don't involve any of that.
Right. And we didn't even mention the people who are being arrested and detained by law enforcement, accused of being MS-13 for simply writing the calling code for El Salvador in their notebook or having a Salvadoran flag. And we know this because the ACLU and other organizations have fought some of these arrests.
Right.
And these kids have been, let go because there's just not evidence to show that some of these people are MS-13 members. It's just part of this heightened fear-mongering that's going on that, law enforcement is actually using to arrest some people who may not have any association with any of these violent gangs.
Wait a minute. You mean to tell me
Here we go again.
that law enforcement agencies would actually arrest people without
little evidence?
Yeah, with little evidence to support the fact that they were doing something illegal. That sounds crazy. Yeah.
I sense the sarcasm.
Oh, maybe.
I think it's coming through everywhere in this this podcast. I think all the listeners can hear it. But yeah, no, it's a problem, and hopefully we can get through our partisan bickering in this country and look back to history, analyze it, and use history as a tool to solve some of the problems that we have in this country right now.
Yeah. Well, I think we definitely do need to talk a little bit about our musical guests.
Well, we do, and I want to do something a little bit different this time around.
Are you kicking us off the mics?
We have done enough talking about a subject that we learned about, that we are passionate about, and that we brought to life in a Newsbeat episode. But
I do want to give one shout out, though, before we go. Hannah Dreyer, reporter for ProPublica, phenomenal piece. Shout out to her and also ProPublica, obviously.
What was the name of the piece?
It's called A Betrayal.
Yes, definitely read that. It's a horrific, sad tragedy. It has all the makings of a Shakespearean play.
And her lead, I don't want to spoil the whole thing. Let's just say that the lead will also, shed a light on the pressure that young immigrants are challenged with, are faced with, to join or to commit heinous acts
on behalf of
a gang.
Yeah. We'll link to that. It's called The Betrayal is the name of the article. It's a ProPublica piece.
It was co-published by ProPublica and New York Magazine. So I think you can actually pick it up if it's in your newsstand,
right.
The latest New York Magazine.
All right. Well, we listen. That's how we do here at Newsbeat. We show love to other journalists. It'd be nice.
Show us some love.
If some of the journalists would show us some love.
We're available for interviews.
Newsbeat@moricreative.com. You can email us because we want to help amplify. We want people to help amplify us just like we help amplify Miss Dreyer. That being said, the people who do help amplify our message with incredible talent, skill, and real passion are incredible. Our artists. Once again, usnewsbeat.com/support if you like the musical aspect of what we do, the lyrical aspect of what we do. I know you do. That's why you're listening to us here. And this time around, because of these special guest artists, now, as the musical director, as the producer, and as the artist liaison, these are my people where I've worked with in the hip hop community for many, many years. And so I reach out to folks that I know are talented, again, impassioned about some of the subjects we talk about. And nobody really fit this episode better, in my mind, than the duo Rebel Diaz. This is a revolutionary hip-hop group, and revolutionary is not thrown out there lightly. This is something and it's not self-proclaimed. These are a couple of really talented artists that use music with a message to fight back against oppression, fight back against immigrant discrimination. These are advocates for these issues that not only create music, but are out there advancing the cause of millions of people who are treated unfairly by government or by media, by all kinds of forces. So I ran into Rebel Diaz many, many years ago in the streets of New York, up in the Bronx, the BX. Shouts to the RDAC family, the Rebel Diaz Arts Collective. These guys were not only making music, but they had opened up a space in New York City for young people to come and learn about civic engagement, to learn about making music, to sort of provide an artistic space, an expressive space where young people in the Bronx come and discuss these issues, perform about these issues, and came together. The Rebel Diaz Arts Collective was shut down at some point in the city from a physical space, but its spirit lives on in the work that Rebel Diaz continues to do, traversing the country, traversing the world, really, speaking at panels and discussions and conferences and performing. I saw them perform in 2017 at South by Southwest for a sort of a political and social justice themed showcase. They're out there doing work. I know that they're going to be at Lehigh University very shortly for as part of a social justice storytelling conference event. So these guys are out there doing the work. I reached out to them for the possibility of contributing to this episode. They were all about it. And as you could tell by their contributions, they are truly all about this work and truly all about these messages. They recruited on our behalf Mr. Cruz Control from Reyes del Bajo Mundo, which is a very well-known, very legendary El Salvadoran hip-hop group. Perfect for the episode. Perfect because he has insight from living, from being in El Salvador, coming here to this country, knowing people, having family members, knowing this story. This was the no-brainer to bring these gentlemen on board for this episode. So I want to take a little bit of time to have a quick chat with these artists.
That'd be phenomenal.
All right, let's do it. Let's talk to Rebel Diaz and kick it a little bit about the work that they do musically and also as advocates and activists.
Yo, peace. This is Rod Stars, and I'm one half of Rebel Diaz.
Peace, peace. One love. This is G1, other half of Rebel Diaz.
All right, guys. We appreciate you doing this. So now we're coming off this really sick episode where we sort of talked about MS-13 and the origins and U.S. intervention in El Salvador. Maybe, Rod, I'll start with you. Sort of you guys, so obviously we talked about intervention in one Latin American country. Now, you guys are children of political refugees from Chile who fled another U.S.-supported regime, one that had violently overthrown the democratically elected Allende government. So can you talk a little bit about how that reality has shaped you as people and artists?
Absolutely. It's defined our lives. You know what I'm saying? We're the children of exiled revolutionaries from Chile who were down with Allende, who were down with the ideas of socialism and of revolutions all over Latin America. It was a historic moment, you know what I'm saying, in which you had the Cuban Revolution and you had movements, all over. But what was unique about Chile is that unique situation in that they had, a socialist government democratically elected into government. You know what I'm saying? That was the first time that happened. It wasn't necessarily through an armed revolution. The people voted. People chose socialism. They chose Salvador Allende and the Popular Unity. And because that new government affected U.S. corporations, and because that new government, wasn't about capitalism, which is what the U.S. is about, the U.S. being the bully and the, watchdog over the world that they are, went in, and there was a CIA-funded and supported military dictatorship. And so that defines our my parents were young college students at that time. My dad was, disappeared for 2 years and incarcerated for 4 as a political prisoner, tortured by U.S. School of the America trained military in Chile. And I was born years later, obviously, as a result of my father being blessed and having survived those concentration camps. So I'm born in England. You know what I'm saying? I got a British passport to this day. So to me, it defines my life. Like I was born in exile. And then ironically, we end up in Chicago. And I grew up in Chicago. And my whole life I was, explaining to people how I was born in England and why I had this British passport. And ironically, we ended up in Chicago, which is the city where the University of Chicago economist Milton Friedman. Now, Milton Friedman was the brainchild of the U.S. military dictatorship in Chile, because it wasn't just as simple as them like going in and because they wasn't down with socialism. They went in with a plan, and that plan was to make Chile a neoliberal experiment. They were literally testing out new forms of capitalism because, capitalism was failing. And so Chile became literally a guinea pig for a U.S. economic experiment, at the price. The price was paid by the Chilean people, in which thousands were tortured, murdered, disappeared. To this day, we still hear stories of people having their body, hundreds of bodies being thrown in the ocean. They're still finding graves to this day of all the people that were murdered. So absolutely, the fact that those are our roots. You know what I'm saying? We're the offspring of the people that Pinochet didn't kill. We keep those ideas alive, and that's why we look at the world with an internationalist perspective. Our parents were members of the revolutionary leftist movement, the MIR, one of the most respected revolutionary organizations in Latin America. And so those are the roots of Rebel Diaz.
And G, what about you? How has that history, what your parents went through, these constant interventions by the United States and Latin America and around the world, how does that inform what you're doing?
Man, for me, I think it's very similar, obviously, to my brother Rod's perspective on it. I'm 5 years younger, so I'm the only one in my family that was born here in the belly of the beast. You know what I'm saying, in the United States and in Chicago. And like Rod said, I think growing up in Chicago, we were amongst the children of refugees from Chile, but we were also amongst the children of refugees from El Salvador, from Guatemala, from Argentina, Uruguay. So we really, grow up. It's like that experience of growing amongst a population that were people that were displaced from their countries because of war being waged by the United States military and CIA and the foreign policy establishment in the U.S. that directly created the conditions for what we grew up in, which was that mix of people. And, you still see that happening. You see it to this day. We always talk about in New York how when we first got to the Bronx, after having grown up in Chicago, there wasn't that many Mexican immigrants. And in Chicago, we got Mexican immigrants that's 3, 4, 5, 6 generations back. And in New York, it was like a newer immigration pattern for the Mexican immigrants arriving. And the reality is that you can't untie that from the effects of NAFTA in '96. So you have NAFTA that goes down, and then you have an influx of new immigrants from Mexico that are particularly from the south of Mexico, from places like Oaxaca, Chiapas, places that were more directly impacted by these trade policies like NAFTA, which, before Mexico's biggest export was corn, maíz. Now the biggest export is people. You know what I mean? And so I think growing up, because of our experiences, having grown up amongst a refugee community, we have that understanding on an international level, not just in particular with our experience in Chile, but on an international level. We have immigrant communities throughout the United States and also in Europe, where we're here as a direct result of United States foreign policy, as a direct result of U.S. Intervention on behalf of, capitalist interests throughout the global South. And, obviously, when it comes to the music and the culture, then we're talking about coming up as a music hip hop guy in the 80s and 90s in Chicago. You talk about having influences of music from all across Latin America, and the Nueva Canción movement, which was a folk protest movement that was a pan Latin American protest song movement that spanned a couple of decades, and you still find the DNA of that music in our music today. You know what I mean? So in so many ways, on the cultural tip, on the political tip, having had that family experience definitely informs the way that we look at the world today.
And Rod, when did you guys first sort of realize that you can sort of use music as a weapon to reach across different races, genders, and inform people about some of the things that you want to discuss in your music, like you do social justice, militarization, capitalism? When did you first realize that you could use music as this tool?
It's crazy. I never even really had like a moment, because I always knew music. The music that I like G was saying, the music we grew up with was revolutionary music. And so music was always a part of social struggle to us. It was never something separate. And I feel like it shouldn't be. You know what I mean? That's a failure at times, I think, movements make, is not having music and culture be an integral part of revolutionary movements. Sometimes they just want to sprinkle it on top of the speeches. But I grew up in spaces in which we had peñas, and peñas were like liberated spaces in which there was folk music, and there was music like Inti Limani, which is like more Andean music, or Silvio Rodriguez, Víctor Jara, Mercedes Sosa, Pablo Milanés, Daniel Biglietti. I'm naming Nueva Canción, Violeta Parra, Nueva Canción, folk singers. You know what I mean? These are the same folks whose lyrics were used by the Pete Seegers and, folk singers of that era here in the U.S. You know what I mean? So for us, it was never a realization. I do think, though, that in a way, I'll keep it 100, is that I did have a moment when hip-hop, was more of a moment. Not necessarily music, but when hip-hop, and that was, us hearing groups like Public Enemy, Poor Righteous Teachers, X-Clan, Dead Prez, KRS-One, later on, Nas, Common, and artists that were talking about things that we related to, having grown up in a revolutionary environment. Because we grew up around all that. We grew up around the fight against apartheid, in South Africa. I remember being a young kid, and hearing about Steve Biko and Mandela. Like, we grew up around that. We grew up around Puerto Rican political prisoner, liberation movements and independence movements in Puerto Rico. And so for us, music was always a part of it, but hip-hop, I think, is when we started hearing the groups. And then even hip-hop as an educational piece, directly, like hip-hop being taught and hip-hop being part of political education. I learned that in Chile, as a young dude going over there and seeing groups like Hipología who were doing hip-hop workshops. I had never seen a hip-hop workshop before. And so that was eye-opening. So I think that a little bit of all of that, hip-hop and music and the Nueva Canción, and then seeing political education in Chile, or seeing hip-hop centers in Germany at squats in Germany, where they had whole buildings taken over and kids
were doing, b-boying in the gym because the gym was taking over. All of that is part of us seeing music and culture that it is and needs to continue being in social movements.
Right. And G, so you guys have been involved in, social and political movements basically since you guys have lived in this country, whether it's against police brutality most recently or speaking out about Occupy Wall Street and how initially it wasn't as diverse as it probably should have been. It wasn't really speaking to the true 99%. So why do you think it's so important to speak out about these injustices that these movements are bringing to light?
I mean, I think that it's always important to have a plurality of voices. In particular, the piece that you said about Occupy was something simple. We had started a community center in the Bronx, and we're doing work in the neighborhood around really just providing alternatives for young people, trying to do a little more proposing as opposed to just opposing. With Occupy, it was just our curiosity, like, yo, what's happening downtown? All these dudes, they taking over the town squares downtown. Let's go peep script. And it's like, yo, we get there, and we treat it like we from another planet Bronx. You know what I'm saying? But again, I think that's already, if you think about it, that's already 7-8 years ago. I think that from the importance of that, you know what I'm saying, we have that language. Despite the contradictions that were involved in that movement, we're left with the very least with the idea of the language of the 99%. This idea that there is a 1% and even less, 0.01% of population that controls the wealth in this country and in the world. So I think that in that sense, it's a victory to still have that language culturally. And for us, it was also about bringing, our culture, bringing the young people's culture from the Bronx also into those spaces. And I see that now, you know what I'm saying, with newer movements that have emerged, you see more inclusiveness, you know what I mean? You see more involvement from historically marginalized communities being at the forefront, and our culture also being at the forefront. But, I think that one of the things that we've also learned is that, and this I think goes back to your previous question, like when we're talking about creating social change or creating some type of social movements where culture is an integral component, at that point, you can't just sing and dance about the revolution. You know what I mean? It has to be some type of action behind it. We always said that, man, what's the difference between, when you're a studio gangster, that's when you talk about just being gangster and you only do it in the studio, but you don't really do gangster stuff on the streets, So this like, what, you going to be a studio rebel? Like you just going to talk about it in the booth, but what type of actual work is going on in the streets to be able to back up those words, you know what I mean, and give it some teeth. And so I think that our experience has been that, there is a space for culture to create power for our communities. I think that, if you look at, it's kind of wild. We went to the community center that we helped build in the Bronx. We were displaced from in a neighborhood that's undergoing heavy gentrification. We just passed by the other day, and I was bugging because they literally, in the last 2 years, have put up like 3 different housing condominium developments. You know what I mean? One of them literally across the street from where our old location was. In some ways, we lost that fight. We were displaced, and because there wasn't enough power built in our community. And so I think that when we talk about culture, we can't limit it to just saying, oh, we want more representation. We want to see ourselves more in these spaces. We want more inclusion. Like, for example, what some of the dialogue around Occupy Wall Street was. And I think that we need to kind of challenge that, you know what I mean? And to say we don't want to just try to sit at the table with y'all. We want to be able to build our own table and cook our own food, you know what I mean? And be able to break bread within our communities in a manner that's self-determined and autonomous. And I think that that's kind of the next step that we need to be looking at, is how culture, beyond just serving as a tool for representing marginalized communities, it needs to be seen as somehow a tool that we can wield to build power in marginalized communities. Because just seeing ourselves on TV and just making the Oscars or the Grammys less white is not going to change the conditions in our communities. It's not going to change the fact that, we have 50 plus schools that have been closed in Chicago in the last few years. I was bugging, this is maybe a little off subject, but just one of the schools that was shut down here in Chicago a couple of years ago by Mayor Rahm Emanuel it's now turned into a temporary training site for the Chicago Police Department. Again, talking about how we can use culture to be able to defend our spaces and our public spaces, our public schools, our public streets, our public housing, being able to defend those things and using culture as a weapon for that, as opposed to just simply being represented.
And Rod, when you guys release Which Side Are You On, which I guess really embodies the revolutionary spirit that you guys are referring to, basically it was a coalition of artists in that track, in that video. You guys said we are living historic moments of oppression to which the people have the right to respond with historic moments of resistance.
See, before I draw the line, let me welcome you close to all the folks who knew Obama sold the people a hoax. Gave the money to suckers while our community's still poor. Withdrew the troops but started another war. Colonizing, terrorizing, creating the oil crisis so they can make a kill on no food and gas prices. Prisons is filling, they trying to lock up the future. Militarized borders and control of computers. Want a stupid bumping music that ain't healthy for the shortest. Privatizing schools and policemen in the hallways.
And obviously that resistance was pre-Donald Trump, so that's not what you're referring to. But do you think we are meeting this historic moment with the sort of resistance that we should be beyond Donald Trump? Specifically, what's going on in the streets that the mainstream media and people don't really discuss?
I think it's a weird space that's going on right now. I don't even know how to really phrase it, you know what I mean, in a more sincere way, because in many ways, Donald Trump's presidency, even him winning in his election, is a direct response to resistance in the streets. You know what I mean? You had an uprising in Ferguson, you know what I mean, and a military occupation of a city in the middle of America, in which you saw the uprising of white America's biggest fear, you know what I mean? Poor black people, you know what I mean? I remember the images and being like, yo, white folks in America are going to be scared. You know what I mean? Because of everything that they've been sold by the media and all that. And so, like, in many ways, you see that. You see Baltimore. And the result of that, you know, under a post-Obama is Donald Trump, another extreme. And I really haven't seen, you know what I mean, people in the streets to the level that we were in 2014, 2015. You know what I mean? People are still being murdered by police, people. But I do think that it's crazy because it all happens in cycles. I do think that response is coming. You know, you have, you know, this being the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King from 1968. Here we are in 2018, 50 years later, you know, and how are we going to respond? How are we going to hit the streets? And so I think that we definitely, you know what I'm saying, are going to have an interesting next couple months. We have, and it's crazy because like you said, you know, the historic moments of oppression, I was writing that. We was writing that. When was that, G? What, 2012? When we did the,
yeah,
you know what I mean? And so you're talking about 6 years ago, whatever. But the point is that now, you know, we live in historic moments for real, you know, in which we have a white supremacist as president, and he's using and exerting his power to the fullest extent, you know. So we'll see. There's all kind of distractions going on with bombings in Syria. There's his own internal FBI situation going on, and it's crazy. So I think that it's an important time to have that, you know, response of resistance be historic as well. You know, I think that the people have always responded, you know, historically against what's going on, and I think that that's going to continue happening.
I would add that in particular when we talk about historic moments of oppression, I think obviously this country is built off a story of oppression and marginalizing entire communities. But in particular, the moment that we're in right now, I think it's important to look back. We always talk about the year 1973 as a marker year. 1973 is the year that the coup happened in Chile, which in a lot of ways marks the beginning of the neoliberal era. 1973 is also the year that Kool Herc threw his famous party at 1520 Sedgwick, and it's marked as one of the beginning sparks of hip-hop culture. 1973 is also the year that oil prices skyrocket for the first time in history, and the United States forms a special relationship with Saudi Arabia, and it's the beginning of the petrodollar. The year also that the United States goes off of the gold standard. And so this year that is so, important to us for so many reasons in terms of the personal history of Chile, in terms of the historical aspect of hip hop culture. It marked the beginning of an era in capitalism. Capitalism had been in crisis, and that's why you had the Arab oil embargo during that year. And so what's the solution? The solution is neoliberalism. The solution is taking the dollar off of the gold standard. The solution is creating a special relationship with Saudi Arabia, making sure that Israel is fortified to serve as a U.S. imperial proxy in the Middle East. And so now, 40 years later, and during that time, we have the biggest loss of wealth in the history of the 20th century. You have the loss of employment while productivity skyrockets. You have a flatlining of wages since that time, and you have also a skyrocketing incarceration rate. And so now what we find ourselves at 40 years later, we find ourselves at another juncture, and capitalism is once again in crisis and is looking for its next way out. And unfortunately, the way that we've been looking at it lately, when you talk about culture, you can't talk about revolutionary culture and resistance cultures without talking about the context of cultural hegemony. We just learned a new word because before I used to pronounce it as he get money, but it's not too different, right? Hegemony, the idea of total control of our culture, cultural hegemony. It's a reality that we live right now. When is the last time you searched something on the internet without using Google? When is the last time you promoted an event without using Instagram or Facebook? So the more and more we're realizing that power is being consolidated in a small amount of hands. And the logic of capital and capitalism continues, except for now, what's being accumulated, the capital accumulation that's going on by the capitalists and those in power that owns the means of production is data. And so now as people, we become the product. And even how the labor market has changed, now everybody has to become their own brand, whether it's, we always say like, yeah, Rebel Diaz, we work for ourselves, man. We don't got no boss and we independent, but you know what? We still work for the brand of Rebel Diaz. If we stop tweeting, if we stop making a presence on social media, our brand and thus our ability to make money and make a living off of that brand dissolves. And so we're entering into a new era of hyper-capitalism, hyper-individualism, and more control by smaller amounts of entities. I mean, the exponential growth in data processing power, in storage capabilities, in AI and algorithm developments. We're living in an unprecedented era where we're not even realizing how much control we're losing over our lives and how we're being forced to turn ourselves into the product. We are the product that we have to sell to the labor market in order to put food on our children's plates and a roof over their head. And so in that era, it becomes increasingly important to develop independent ways of messaging, whether it's doing a mural on the street, whether it's putting music out for free and making sure that you don't just have it on Spotify, but that you are at all the bootleg sites if you have to do it, that you're out there reaching the people, connecting with them. How often are we losing that personal human connection, which is such an integral part of culture? So often when we talk about culture these days, it's like we just talking about something that's based on the internet, that's digital, that's unseen, untouched. You know what I mean? So how can we reclaim that aspect of culture that actually involves people? I think that's a very important talk when we talk about resistance, because the real talk, the resistance, that even that word is wild because the fact that you pointed it out, like there's a resistance, the word means like a different thing in the post-Trump era because it has been co-opted by the Democratic Party and the Rachel Maddows who want you to resist Donald Trump, but they down with Donald Trump if he goes to war with Russia or Iran or Syria. And they're down with Donald Trump when he supports Israel, but they just don't want him to be a bigot. That's wild. No, when we talk about resistance, we want real resistance, which means resisting, the imperial ambitions of this crumbling empire. You know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, it's getting to a point where, and it's real. Just look at the budgets here in Chicago. They spend 50% of the city's operating budget on policing. And even on the national level, the amount we're spending on missiles, or the crazy fact about each of these missiles that was dropped in Syria and how much, one of those missiles could have solved the water crisis situation in Flint, Michigan. You feel me? And so, again, for us, I think that when we talk about historic moments of oppression. We recognize that we're in a turning point, that capitalism is once again in crisis, and those in power and that control the global economy are going to want to seek to further consolidate that power. And for us, it's literally the survival of the human race depends on our ability to be able to break that system down through all and every means in which and culture is an integral part of that.
Right, and I think, and well, at least I hope we know where you guys are coming from as an independent news outlet trying to put out information that is not really being discussed on mainstream media, where it's Russia, 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 practically all day long, 24/7. And now we're also using music to sort of inform some of the messaging, if not amplify it. So can you guys talk about just your contribution to this episode that we just released, MS-13, Made in the USA? For our listeners, can you just talk about the creative process, which they might be interested in, and sort of where you found your inspiration to produce such a visceral track?
Absolutely. We received the beat. So we didn't make the beat. We just received it. We heard it in the beginning. We was like, oh, this is like the West Coast. It's got like a little West Coast flavor to it. You know what I mean? Even myself as an MC that grew up, not really seeing too many Latino MCs. We had like Cypress Hill, but then there was also groups like Delinquent Habits, who's like huge in Chile, and there was kind of like a little West Coast flow to that. You know what I mean? There's a little vibe that I felt. G laid down the hook on the creative tip within Rebel Diaz. G's very musical. He's a lot more musical than I am, I believe. And so he came up with the ill hook. I think we were only supposed to do verses, but we, like I said, we do songs, man. So we turned it into a joint. And after we laid down the bars, we were like, yo, we should reach out to our brother Cruz from Reyes del Bajo Mundo, which means Kings of the Underground, from El Salvador. They're one of the illest, they're like the pioneers of a lot of the hip hop things going on in El Salvador. Like many, through immigration and so the brothers are now in New York. And so we built with the brother crew, like, man, this is a song about the MS-13, about El Salvador. We got to have the brother from El Salvador be on it. So we hit him up. He jumped on it. He blessed us, and jumped on the song. And, maybe Giga explained the hook. He the one that did the hook, but, it breaks it down. And what we spit in is how we feel about the situation. We're clear that the U.S., through civil wars that they funded, civil wars against movements of liberation, the same movements of liberation that were in line with our family's political views in Chile. So we talking about folks that are against the FMLN in El Salvador. The U.S. government was against Sandinistas. We're clear on that. And I say it in my verse. I'm like, there was Contras all over Central America, and so long story short, we laid it down and it was dope, man. We feel it as a song, not even that just as a contribution to the podcast. We might have to bump it in the wind. Word.
Go for it.
My main sentiment approaching this joint was like, yo, why? I don't even know if you guys kept this part in the actual broadcast, but at the beginning of the song, I'm kind of like muttering, like, yo, why we even talk about this, man? The only reason why we talking about this is because Trump want to talk about it. You know what I mean? And I think it is important to talk about it because we need to be able to provide counter information to the disinformation that's put forth by the likes of Trump and mainstream media. But at the end of the day, we cannot forget that the main reason we even have this conversation is because the MS-13 is being used as an instrument of fear to be able to excuse A, economic failures domestically, and B, to be able to have an excuse to also go into messing with other countries. Simple as that. You know what I mean? And so whether it's indirect intervention, in Latin America, just recently the U.S. supported a coup that occurred, on multiple occasions at this point in the last 10 years in Honduras. You know what I mean? And so when we talk about the maras, the gangas, the pandillas, the gangs,
Ganga, pandilla, gang, sets, traps, land, bang, same as it ever been. Blame it on the immigrants. Whenever recession hits, find something to sell them with. Fear, black youth that gon' get at you. Bald-headed, tatted, brown bodies are a terror suit. Let the news tell it.
whatever you want to, the words that you want to call these street organizations, in regards to how it's being treated in the mass conversation, it's like the hook said, the same as it ever been. It's blame it on the immigrants whenever a recession hits. Find something to sell them with. Like, that's real. Like, whenever we have a situation of, and you can look at the patterns in this country historically, whenever you have a time of economic recession, when you have times of economic uncertainty, there needs to be a scapegoat. You know what I mean? And so you'll see increased news coverage of supposedly violent immigrants or terrorists or this and that. And so that's the context in which we hit it from, you know what I mean? Which is like, yo, this whole conversation is also a conversation that has been imposed on us by as a way of scapegoating certain communities. You know what I mean? I'll start off my verse talking about, you know what I'm saying, fear. It's the black youth that gonna get at you. The bald-headed, tatted brown bodies are a terror too. You know what I'm saying? And that's real too. Like, we can't talk about the levels of racism inherent in some of the criticism and treatment and analysis of these street organizations like MS-13 without talking about the reality also that young black people are getting gunned down every day. You know what I'm saying? Still in this country. You know what I mean? And so I think that's the energy behind the joint is that, you know, and I think there's one point in the joint that we say, you know what I'm saying, like, the lines get erased. You know what I'm saying? When you talk about put all these images of the, you know, brown skinned, tatted, bald people, you know, that's supposedly a menace to your community, at what point does the line get blurred where it's like, hey, maybe that bald-headed, tatted dude is actually not a member of a street organization and he's just a regular old hardworking dude, but his image is that of a violent criminal. You know what I mean? So what's also the dangers, you know what I'm saying, of those lines getting erased? And at the end of the day, also the political line that Rebel Diaz holds is that, you know what I'm saying, we say that no human being is illegal. We don't say, you know, let's have a little bit of crumbs and get some immigration reform and maybe let's legalize a second-class citizenship for immigrants. Nah, we saying that no human being is illegal. If you're going to open up the borders for commerce and for goods, you need to open up the border for people. And the reality is that that's also a part of the conversation when we talk about immigration. You know what I'm saying? In what context are we putting it in? And for us, again, we feel that, you know, amnistía para todos, amnesty for all, no human being is illegal. And also a component of that is abolish prisons. You know what I'm saying? We believe that there's other forms there can be other forms that we can deal with criminal elements in our or antisocial elements in our society, in our communities, that doesn't have to deal with the criminal injustice system, which is an extension of the structures of slavery in this country. You know what I mean? So for us, that's an important thing to talk about too, because, you know what I mean, we all want to be safe in our communities. I want to be able to walk with my shorties, with my partner, my babies down the block, and not have to worry about any inter-community violence. But at the same time, I don't want to have to worry about getting gunned down by the police. You know what I mean? So how is it that we can create safe communities that are autonomous, that are self-governing? And that means building power in our neighborhoods. It means getting to know our neighbors. It means not doing activism only online. It means seeing each other face to face. You know what I mean? So I think that the energy behind that is, behind the song, behind the lyrics are that, you know, we're going to talk about this issue. Let's make sure that we put it in its proper context.
Right. And just quickly before we let you guys go, what should people look forward to in the coming future for you guys?
Oh, so we actually got a lot coming out. We're about to release our first all Spanish language album titled America versus America. That's how it's spelled out. So America like in Spanish versus America with 3 Ks is the title. We're about to put out our first single off that album called Iba a Caer. There's Rebel Diaz featuring Ana Tiju, MC from Chile. That's real dope. Yeah, it's a dope album. You know what I'm saying? A lot of that roots that we talked about, I think you'll be able to hear that. And it's us really talking to our people in Latin America and really to a large portion of our peeps out here in the U.S. as well that speak Spanish and have grown up with that as a second language. And then we have another project which is Rebel Diaz and our brother Tef Poe from St. Louis. And that project together is called Multiply. And, you know, we got some joints on there. It's us rocking the English. So, yeah, it's Rebel Diaz and Tef Poe. We got music featuring The Reminders, featuring Sci Rock. Rod Digger's on a joint. We got a joint with Bamboo. It's dope. It's a dope project. We're really looking forward to releasing it soon. And, yeah, just keeping that struggle alive. And, you know, from the music to the message to the street. That's what we on.
Great. Looking forward to hearing that. Sounds like you guys are really coming full circle. So on behalf of the Newsbeat crew over here, we really appreciate you guys contributing to this episode and taking some time out to speak with us. So big thanks, Rod Stars and G1 from Rebel Diaz. Thanks a lot, guys.
Peace to y'all, brothers. Thank y'all for all the work that y'all do as well, man.
Appreciate it.
Peace.
So there you have it, guys. This backbeat for our episode MS-13, Made in America. Shouts once again to Rebel Diaz, Cruise Control, Jose Miguel Cruz, Raymond Bonner, Patrick Young, and all of you for your ears and for your attention and for sharing, supporting, and blessing us as we do this work.
Oh, real quick thing?
Yeah, man.
I never interrupt you during
No,
an
let's
outro.
do it.
If people do want to learn more about
Absolutely.
the Salvadoran Civil War, I recommend that you actually pick up Raymond Bonner's book. That was actually republished by Or Books recently, and it's called Weakness and Deceit, America and El Salvador's Dirty War. So check that out.
Yeah, he was a fascinating guy, and thanks, Mr. Bonner, for your contribution. As journalists, we look up to folks like you, really out there. You know, we talk about how important it is for journalists to go there.
He went there.
My man went there, and he went there again, and he really brought great insight to the table. So that was actually, I mean, you know, Pulitzer Prize winner, man. I know he doesn't care much about it. We do. So shouts to him. Shouts to everyone involved. Shouts to you, Chris Tawarski, our editor-in-chief. Shouts to you, Rashad Mian, our managing editor. Shouts to me, Manny Faces, producer and host of Newsbeat and BackBeat. And once again to Jed Morey, our executive producer, and all the team at Morey Creative Studios. Don't forget, Morey Creative Studios can help you in your business with inbound marketing, lead generation, sales
Support.
Sales enablement.
I think it's sales enablement. I don't think it's
Sales support, sales enablement.
a little different.
Retention.
Something about
All
retention.
the businessy things that your business needs. Websites.
You can tell we're journalists. We don't.
Leads, marketing.
Getting seen. I think it's all about getting seen.
It's all about getting seen.
And
SEO.
Getting noticed. We all want to be noticed.
Pamphlets.
Yep.
Whatever you need, More Creative can help you out there.
Step and
Fantastic.
repeats.
Yes, we need some of those. Oh, check it out. When is this coming out? Okay, cool. April 21st. Are you in the New York, New Jersey area? There's a 2018 Makers Day event happening at the Jersey City Boys and Girls Club. Me, Manny Faces, accompanied by some members of the Newsbeat team, will be there to present on our podcast. Check it out. We'll link to it in our little blurb that goes along with this on the website, usnewsbeat.com. Other than that, we'll be back with another episode very shortly. Do follow us on social media, US Newsbeat in most places. Do share our stuff. Tell your peoples about it. Tell your friends, neighbors, supporters, haters that they need to check out the Newsbeat podcast to hear an unconventional look at conventional wisdom. We are a social justice and civil liberties oriented podcast that sounds really good. Check us out, usnewsbeat.com. My name is Manny Faces. We are out. Peace.
Wow, this guy really got in the zone there at the end.
You really got in the zone, man.
All right, let's go eat.
The Newsbeat podcast is owned by Newsbeat, Inc. Visit us at usnewsbeat.com. The producer and host of Newsbeat is Manny Faces. Our editor-in-chief is Christopher Tawarski. Newsbeat's managing editor is Rashad Mian. The executive producer of Newsbeat is Jed Morey. Our podcast and website are co-produced and managed by Morey Creative Studios. Newsbeat relies on listener support and grants. Artists that appear on the podcast are compensated for original material. To support Newsbeat or contribute to our Artist-in-Residence program, visit us at usnewsbeat.com and click on Support. Subscribe to Newsbeat by Morey Creative Studios wherever you download your podcasts by searching for Newsbeat.